I'd like to welcome you to this session. We're going to have a discussion about Brexit and the UK leaving the EU. The UK is quite a small country. However, we do consider ourselves as quite a dominant country in ATMP space, and we're considered one of the top 5 global leaders in the space. So we thought it would be interesting to have a look at the impact of Brexit, that is the UK leaving the EU, on the regulatory space. I have to admit that when we both agreed to give this talk a number of months ago, we thought that maybe we would know where we were going to be. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. So what we'll do is we'll have a little talk about the various options, and then we'll pick up on just some general EMA, MHRA-related things. So I think what we'd like to do is we'll talk through some various aspects, and I'll look out for questions as we go along. So if you want to ask a question as we go along, please do. And we'll have a general question and answer session at the end also. So if I can turn to Christiana, who's been in the tissue and cell space, in the regulatory space, for about 12 years now. She was initially at the Human Tissue Authority, which is the competent authority in the EU, in the UK for tissues and cells, and then moved to the MHRA, the competent authority for medicines. She also was the primary CAT, so the Committee of Advanced Therapies representative for the UK for over 5 years. And in that role, Christiana actually was responsible for reviewing, was the rapporteur for quite a few of the approved ATMPs in Europe, and also was responsible for doing many of the important guidelines, such as the gene therapy guidelines. So she's very expert in this space. So she will be able to add value for both the MHRA and from the EMA point of view, hopefully. So if we look at where Brexit is, and there's various options with it, we have a hard stop the 31st of October, so Halloween. And the reason why it's Halloween is there's a new commission comes into place on the 1st of November. So as such, we need to, a new parliament takes place. So we need to have a decision by the 31st of October. We started the Brexit process about 3 years ago, and we now have less than a month to actually come up with a deal. So it's quite tight, we could say. So there's a couple of options. We could have a deal, we could agree a deal, which we're trying to do just now, and the UK Prime Minister has offered some suggestions only yesterday. If the deal happens, then we'll go into what we call a transitional phase, where we'll exit out of the EU in an orderly way, and in a way it's called a soft Brexit. We're not quite sure where we will how that will go. If we don't come up with a deal, then we have a scenario called hard Brexit, which means that as of the 31st of October, we leave, which is less than a month from now. And the other option is there's a delay, or there's another referendum, and there's a reversal, and we actually don't leave the EU at all. So all of those are possibilities. So Christiana, if I can turn to you, what would you say, really it is in your opinion, where do you think, if you're able to comment, where we might land, and what do you think the possibility and the options are with those?
I should perhaps declare myself as a pro-European, as I've got dual German and British nationality by now. Well, I do think, though, that the laws that Parliament have in place make it less likely now. I'm hoping that we're seeing a no deal. So I think it will be either a deal or a re-referendum. I'm someone who still hopes for a re-referendum, really, myself, to be honest. But I think no deal is perhaps less likely now.
But if there was a no deal, because that is possibly worst case scenario in some respects, what are the preparations that the MHRA have put in place for either of the scenarios?
So a lot of the MHRA preparations have gone into no deal preparedness, and in a way, actually, that's where the sort of boundaries were also clearest known, because if we have a deal, there is actually not that much specifics in the agreement, but we can discuss that later. So I'm actually quite happy that the MHRA space is going to be one of the few spaces that is going to be a sort of well thought out area if there is no deal. And the MHRA would be a freestanding regulator. All the legislation has been transposed into UK law. So there would be, you would be able to submit any applications that you wanted on the 1st of November, really, as soon as you want to. There's a portal there for submitting the information. And yeah, so I think from the MHRA perspective, the preparations have been very detailed. And I think it's clear that also the feeling is that the approach is very similar to the approach that's taken in the EU, so there shouldn't be suddenly any very great changes in the way that, data and assessments are viewed or conducted. So from that perspective, the MHRA is going to align themselves as much as possible with the EU.
And in the case of a soft Brexit, where we do transition out, there's less clarity about that, but what have the preparations been for the MHRA?
In a way, so the transition period under the withdrawal agreement is 2 years, and under those 2 years, the MHRA would actually not be able to would still be within the European Medicines Agency framework, i.e. we would accept any decisions made by them and would be bound by their rules. But during those 2 years, the MHRA would actually not be allowed to do any official assessment work, anything like that. And I should say that transition period has actually already started on the 1st of April this year. And that time will then be taken, it will always be 2 years, so the longer this takes, the less than is at the sort of tail end of the transition period. The MHRA then will definitely aim to be part of the European committees as a sort of discussing member, as it were, even if obviously they're not going to have any casting voting rights. But the details of that are yet to be finalized, it has to be said. And certainly so far, the MHRA has still continued to actively participate in all the working parties and committees in Europe at the EMA and also in the guidelines.
Okay, thanks. And if we think about where people are in the development pathway, a lot of the audience, I'm sure, they'll be in clinical trial situation and thinking about coming to Europe to do clinical trials, which we already know is quite challenging with 28 member states and all requiring slightly different requirements. Where do you see, if there's a hard Brexit, where do you see the UK will land in terms of clinical trials, and what will be the impact on clinical trials?
Well, I think the impact will actually be fairly minimal in that space, because the approval of clinical trials is already a competency of the national regulatory authorities. So in that respect, it won't really change. If you wanted to conduct any trial in the UK, you already had to apply to the UK. Also, at the same time, data in the European space, clinical trials data that have not been gathered from within the EU are already accepted as part of any submissions. So, and international trials are already an option for anyone who wants to conduct these. So the UK actually being inside or outside of the EU should actually not really make a great deal of difference for those scenarios.
So that's for approval, but once you, assuming you're approved, and then your trial's up and running, I know that some of the concerns that people have are QP release, import, export. What changes will there be in the case of a hard Brexit?
Yeah, so import-export is the disadvantage. I can only say what happens from the UK perspective. Again, trying to make things as painless as possible. So QPs from the EU will actually continue to be recognized for, I think it's 1 or 2 years minimum, following a no-deal date. And so import in the UK into the UK will not be a problem. In terms of import from the UK into a different EU country, you'd actually have to contact the national competent authority of that member state there. Again, because the clinical trials are member state competency. Yeah, but the hope is that member states will be quite reasonable there, but we can't really speak for all the other 27 member states.
So in terms of a QP release, I think what you're saying is if a trial was taking place in the UK and, say, Germany, you would approach the PI in Germany and ask if they would accept the UK QP certification for a clinical trial, not the EMA, because I think people sometimes get confused on that.
Yes, that's right. So the EMA actually has no competency in that sort of scenario, in that problem. EMA is responsible for marketing authorizations only and any changes to a product that's already approved.
Sure.
So.
Okay. And then in terms of with the clinical trial regulation coming into force at some point in the nearest future, what impact will that have if the UK has indeed left the EU?
So the clinical trials regulation, because it's not actually in force at the moment, wouldn't be transposed into UK law if it's not enforced on exit day. It would only be translated into UK law if it's actually in force. Having said that, the UK again would aim to align themselves quite closely with all the provisions of that regulation. Initially, people are at the moment advised to use the normal submissions portals, but eventually the UK will have their own portal for that.
Okay, so there'll be a separate portal.
Separate portal. Yeah.
And in terms of so that would be the equivalent of UDRACT, presumably. And the adverse event portal, is that, there'll be an equivalent also in the UK?
Yes, yeah, there is. There will be equivalents for all of that.
Okay.
I mean, I should say, if there's really, I mean, this is true for clinical trials and sometimes authorized products. We've got a lot of autologous products where maybe you're collecting starting material from patients in the UK, then have to ship them to the EU, manufacturing there and ship them back. And a lot of these products are very important if people are critically ill. So if there's any issues, I would advise you that you actually contact at the first instance, the national competent authority in the member state that gives you problems. So for example, if you have any issues with the import of UK material into that member state. But if you then continue to have problems, do contact the MHRA, because really, I think there should be a general willingness to provide important clinical material to patients and not to hinder, potentially life-saving treatments. We've had a few cases at the MHRA where there seem to be some issues, and actually a direct contact between those regulatory agency was able to actually sort things out very, very quickly. Okay.
And when you say contact the MHRA, would that just be through the clinical trials help desk? How is that the best approach? Or?
It depends a little bit. If there is import-export issues, then it's probably not a bad idea to, if it's in clinical trials, maybe clinical trials or also the biologicals unit, but they will in most likely they will make contact then with the inspectorate, and it's going to be between the inspectorates to sort most of that out.
Okay, and then in terms of the starter material, the import and export of the starter material, obviously that's also a European competency, a member state competency. Would you, because we have heard in the UK that there's issues with import and export of materials, and if the UK becomes a third country, we then have to comply with the European import-export. Would you advise the same there, to go to the competent authority of the member state for tissues and cells and have that discussion? Or would you run it through the UK competent authority?
That depends a bit if you're talking within the course of a marketing authorization or
for clinical trial, or for either, I suppose.
For clinical trials, definitely the national competent authorities. There are some provisions that are within the EU, particularly for ATMPs, which are meant to make certain import-export situations a little bit easier. Most of them are contained in the ATMP-specific GMP guideline that's been published, and that allows you to, for example, limit the retesting of your release information when you're importing into the EU. So if you are in a third country, manufacturing your product in a third country, and then bring it and have done the release testing there, you wouldn't have to necessarily repeat the entire testing panel on import into the EU if you can show that it's maybe time critical, and also there's not enough material and so on. So if you justify that, and potentially that would also apply. Well, it should also apply to the UK.
But clearly
and that would be a centralized decision to be made for marketing authorizations in the main.
And that would be for short shelf life or for limited availability of samples, presumably for a large-scale allogeneic. They would want retesting in the EU, or is that still uncertain?
No, that's likely to be one. If you have time and a lot of material, it's unlikely that you'll get away with not doing it.
Before I move on to my next questions, are there any questions from the floor on clinical trials or tissues and cells?
When you're doing those clearances and you have the exceptions, are you doing that on a shipment-by-shipment basis, or is this established then with the authorities that these shipments can move with the proper documentation?
For the centralized, it's definitely a general acceptance, and I think actually also for clinical trials, once you've got the pathway sorted, then it should be not a problem.
Any more? Okay, we could move on to licensure. Again, the QP, what we talked about for QP for clinical trials, that just transfers over to licensure also. But I think there's a couple of things that people are concerned about in terms of licensure, and I think it'd be worth having the discussion about what people should do. So I suppose if you're going through licensure, you're just about to have approval. What would be the case there if they're going through licensure and receive approval from the EU? What would happen in the UK?
If any approval that you have prior to again, talking in a no-deal scenario, prior to exit day, that would be automatically fully accepted by the MHRA and would be sort of grandfathered in. That includes actually where you've got the final decision from the CHMP, but you haven't got the official commission decision, which usually takes a few more weeks to get, but that's all fully accepted. Then in terms of if you're actually going through the process at the time that the UK leaves the EU, it depends then basically how far you're into this process, what your options are. There is actually a very useful, it's quite complicated because there's so many steps in the assessment process, but there's a very useful table on the MHRA website telling you what your options are. In essence, if you are, to cut a long story short, if you're pre-day 120, that is if you haven't received your first list of questions yet, basically then you have to kind of start afresh. You have to pay the full separate fee also to the MHRA, but you have different options in that scenario of whether you actually wanted to wait for the EMA opinion and then receive a targeted assessment from the MHRA, or whether you wanted to just have a parallel assessment at the same time with the UK. And there is really a great desire to be at least as quick as the EMA in that assessment process. So if you start from scratch, you should get your decision at the same time. If you wait for the EMA opinion, you will have to provide the entire assessments reports to the MHRA, and they actually commit to make the decision no later than you would have the commission decision.
Oh, really? So that's what. So the targeted assessment has the aim of approving at the same time, if it is approval,
yes,
at the same
quick.
time as the
Yeah.
EM. Oh, okay.
Okay. If you are past day 120 and you're already in the process of responding to questions, really, that you've got, then again, you have a number of options which are kind of broadly similar to this approach, either waiting for the EMA assessment reports and sharing them with the MHRA, or just asking the MHRA to take over from that point of time and continue with their assessment. In terms of fees past, I think there's no fees once you've gone past day 120, i.e. the first round of questions. But that information is on their website.
Okay, okay. And once we've left and we've got past, so there's no application in process, I assume, well, in fact I know that people will have to submit in parallel, or they can submit in advance to one or the other, to the UK and to the EU. As someone who's been through the national licensing route myself, and I know that you do biologics, do you see any advantage in submitting to the UK first, for instance, before going to the EU? Or?
Yeah, I mean, for various reasons. So there'll actually be different offerings in the UK. In addition to the targeted assessment and the standard assessment, you'll also have the option for an accelerated assessment, which refreshingly, I don't actually remember the timelines anymore in detail now. But the good thing of the difference between that accelerated assessment is actually there is no entry requirements, so you need to have a new active substance or a biologic or a biosimilar, but you don't have to show that there's a high unmet medical needs, any significant innovation. So it's really open for all these products without any pre-qualification, so that's quite important. There is also a program under development at the moment that they've named rolling review, and that's a sort of perhaps it's a sort of iterative approach where you can actually submit part of your dossier. You could, for example, start with the quality only, or maybe with the non-clinical data, and then receive an assessment from that, and then evolve things over time, and getting quite detailed regulatory feedback on that until you're then ready to submit all of the modules, and then the last stage of the assessment report should be hopefully fairly quick because they're already very familiar with your information, and so that's perhaps quite a nice offering in terms of iterative review and help during development. So
I think that when I heard about the rolling review, I actually thought it was really attractive. I think especially for ATMP developers, because as we all know, quite often these are so innovative products that the regulators themselves are learning as well as the developers. So I think the rolling review would work really, really well. Is there a level, is it an unmet need, or is it any product can undergo rolling review?
No, there isn't really, not as far as I'm aware, actually. No, there isn't. I think at the moment, it's quite early stages in the development of that. So MHRA has only really started thinking of this. It does say you need to be sort of thereabouts of actually being in a position to submit an MAA. So if you're just entering phase 1, then it's maybe a little bit premature to start the rolling review process. But if you think you're actually in the phase where you're gathering clinical trials, pivotal clinical trials information, then that is probably the phase where you should be thinking about that. And hopefully you've been in touch with the MHRA beforehand via maybe the Innovation Office or something like that to make them aware of that scientific advice.
I think it's a long time since I've done a national application, but I think it's 120 for an accelerated review, but I can't remember. So there's a chance that it might actually be quicker than the EU, potentially. Okay.
Well, that's the hope anyway. And
before I move on and ask some general questions of Christiana, does anyone have any questions about marketed products, both, the impact of Brexit on the EU and in the UK? We've got a question over there.
So my question is, assuming a hard Brexit, does MHRA intend to have some sort of a mutual recognition agreement with EMA? And here's why I'm asking the question. One submits an MAA, there's a hard Brexit. I'm assuming that GMP certificates and manufacturing licenses issued by EMA to British manufacturers or testing sites become null and void.
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure.
So the mutual recognition, so if there's a mutual recognition between...
Assuming a hard Brexit, how does MHRA and EMA intend to work to recognize each other's licenses of manufacturing and testing facilities?
Yes, I was with you until that part anyway. So, yeah, as I said, a targeted assessment in the UK will anyway be an option where the UK MHRA takes into account the EMA assessment reports. That doesn't actually tell you that they'll necessarily come down on exactly the same side in every single case, but they will certainly take it into account. And if you look at the history of UK's participation in the EMA approval process, you will see that the UK normally sided with a majority view on approval, so hopefully there shouldn't be any great divergence. It's difficult to say how the EMA is going to view the UK assessment. I would think that really within the committees, the UK's experience with all of these products would weigh quite heavily. So if you had a positive opinion, it would certainly should not stifle your progress in Europe. It would really mean that an extremely reputable regulator has reviewed all of the dossier and come to a positive opinion. I would think that actually has quite a strong influence in Europe, even if they might not want to say such a thing at the moment outright, because at the moment we're so much subject to the ups and downs of the daily political debate. But I think that will hopefully be the case.
And if I could add another mutual recognition agreement slant to it. So if you're also thinking about GMP, then the mutual recognition, obviously if the UK left, then they wouldn't be part of the EU, so they're not part of the mutual recognition global scheme, if that's what you're asking. But because the UK have been inspected recently as part of the MRA, the mutual recognition scheme, and the fact that they're already a member, it is anticipated that they will actually be able to join it as an independent member state as part of the mutual recognition. So the GMP certification should be recognised, just as it would be. Any more questions?
Well, just as a comment at Fraser Wright Stanford, you know, having been involved, I guess attended maybe 2 MHRA, you know, or IND stage types of interactions. I mean, they were very helpful and supportive, and I hope that there are efforts being made to continue that type of interaction. Having access, obviously, into the EU had been very important, so that's kind of a political thing. But I'd also, I think, just maybe going back to the previous question as well, I mean, it is one thing to have a likelihood of a similar assessment, but it's a different thing probably for developers who have made efforts up till now to, you know, gain access into these markets to all of a sudden have to jump through another hoop. So I don't know if that might have been part of the question that was asked previously. Is there, you know, at least for a handover phase of some years, yes, we will mutually recognize. To me, that would be an important consideration. Yes,
I mean, unfortunately, if there is a hard no-deal Brexit, then there isn't going to be a handover period. It should be said, though, that I think the MHRA has worked extremely hard to make the additional hoop very similar to the original hoop, and in terms of, you know, exactly the same data really needing to be provided into pretty much an identical looking portal, with the only difference being, you know, some regional information that we obviously don't need for Europe in there. So hopefully it would, from that perspective, not be too painful, but I do appreciate that, you know, people would obviously prefer it to be all in one. So would I.
I'm full out of time, and I've been told that I've not to allow any more questions.